Gonzaga returns to the Kennel tonight for the first time in 28 days, hoping the home crowd and a so-so opponent can get this team back on the right track.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Wednesday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by TNT, folks. The college football playoffs are here, and you don't want to miss a moment of the action. The college football playoff is presented by Allstate, and it begins with 4 first-round games December 20th and 21st on ESPN, ABC, TNT, and Max. Well, folks, we got an update on the game time for Gonzaga versus UCLA, not this Saturday, but next Saturday, the 28th. We also got some quotes from the Pac-12 Commissioner Teresa Gould talking about the media rights deal for Gonzaga's future conference. We're going to talk about all that to close out the show. But first, we're going to get you ready for tonight's game against the Colonels of Nichols State. The Zags are hosting Nichols at the McCarthy Athletic Center Wednesday evening, 6 p.m. Pacific time. The game will be on ESPN Plus. And the latest update from my friend Stephen Carr, posted this on social media, posted it on Twitter and Blue Sky. He's working at Gonzaga right now, and he indicated that after the last time Gonzaga played a home game and it was a bit of a fiasco with Long Beach State and not knowing where the game was streamable, the plan right now going forward for these games that are not on a big broadcast network like ESPN or CBS Sports or FS1 or anything like that, the Spokane market will remain the same. If you're in that media market, you will be on KHQ or SWX. Either way, you'll be able to watch the game there. If you are in the Seattle market, you should be able to watch it on Fox 13 Plus, which I believe would be on Fubo or any of the other, maybe YouTube TV, etc. And the plan is that everybody else, which includes Portland area Zag fans like myself, the game will be on ESPN Plus. If you are struggling, he told me to do this, you can find it on Blue Sky, the interaction. If you're unable to find the game, it's 5:45, 5:50, whatever, right before it starts, go bug him. He said he's free to be bugged, so you can go let him know. Hopefully, though, we don't run into the same issues that we ran into last time Gonzaga had a home game against Long Beach, where a lot of people were unable to watch that game. As I said in the cold open, this is Gonzaga's first home game in nearly a month. Their last home game, that game against Long Beach State, was November 20th. So 28 days after that game. This is I wasn't able to look this up. I didn't have the time to do so, but I suspect this is among the longer breaks without a true home game that Gonzaga's played in a non-conference slate. Obviously, they always have a gap in the late November time period, and it's not unusual for their early December games to be high-profile contests like Kentucky and UConn and things of that nature. But it did feel like there was an abnormally long period of time where they weren't playing any games at the Kennel. We talked about it a little bit on Tuesday's show as a mailbag question of potentially contributing to some of Gonzaga's kind of flatness that we've seen in those last couple of games. But this is now an opportunity for Gonzaga to kind of right the ship. First ever meeting between Gonzaga and Nichols. The Zags are 6-0 all-time against the Southland Conference, which is where Nichols participates. Their most recent game against the Southland Conference was the first-round game of the NCAA tournament last year, when as a 5-seed Gonzaga absolutely walloped the 12-seeded Cowboys of McNeese State, coached by Will Wade. That was the last time Gonzaga played a team in the Southland Conference. Again, they have not lost to a team in that league. We're going to talk a little bit more about who this Colonels team is. They are a program located in Thibodaux, Louisiana is where the program is located. They are 7-4 on the year. They are 2-0 in Southland Conference play. They've actually won 4 games in a row, although 2 of those 4 straight victories were against non-Division I opponents. In fact, 3 of their 7 wins have come against teams not at the Division I level. The wins that they do have against D1 programs are Northern Kentucky, Louisiana, Southeast Louisiana, and New Orleans. None of those teams rank particularly high at KenPom. Northern Kentucky's 213th, Southeast Louisiana's 223rd, Louisiana's 310th, and New Orleans among the worst teams in college basketball at 346. This team has 4 losses. Their first loss of the season was their opener against New Mexico. Not a bad loss by any stretch of the imagination. New Mexico is currently 70th at KenPom, began the year higher than that. They only lost that game by 7, so it's not too bad. Played South Alabama, lost to them by 6. They are 197th at KenPom. They also lost to Towson by 6, who's 224th at KenPom. So 3 losses, all by 6 or 7 points. The other loss, however, is quite notable. It was to Cincinnati, a top 25 team, the only top 25 team they have played this year. They lost that game by 37 points. KenPom has Cincinnati 24th in the country right now. Again, they are a top 25 ranked team, a very good team, but Nichols didn't put up much of a fight against Wes Miller and the Bearcats in that game. KenPom has Nichols at 242nd in the most updated rankings as I'm recording this. KenPom also has projections for every game. It currently projects the Zags to win this one by 27 points, which in fact is actually below the spread. We'll talk about the spread a little later in the show, but yeah, this is the kind of contest this is. We haven't had very many of these this year. Gonzaga loaded up the non-conference schedule. Usually their first game or two is an easier opponent. This year they open it up by playing Baylor, and then they went Arizona State. They played San Diego State earlier in the year. They just haven't had a lot of these types of matchups. And I think you need a few of these. They have this one. They got Bucknell in a couple of days, so they got a few of them kind of coming up. But we know the WCC is not super strong. It's not the Big 12. It's not the SEC. It's not any of those conferences. But you still need a few of these early in the season to kind of get right. And I think this is a good opportunity for them to do so. KenPom has Nichols as the 269th team ranked in adjusted offensive efficiency, 202nd defensively, 168th in tempo. Pretty average to below average in basically every facet of college basketball this season. There's just not a lot to really love about what this team does. Offensively, they're shooting about 49.5% on 2-pointers. That ranks 274th in the country. They're shooting 30.5% on 3-pointers. That ranks 302nd in the country. They're shooting 64.6% from the free throw line. That is 333rd. So they're basically outside the top 275 percentage-wise as a 2-point shooting team, as a 3-point shooting team, and as a free throw shooting team. Now, they do have 2 guys who shoot a high volume of 3-pointers. Neither of them are super efficient. One of them is Ike Cornish. He is shooting 7.5 3-pointers per game. And folks, he only plays 19 minutes a game. This dude just gets in the game and jacks up threes. He's making them at about 34%. So not great, but also not terrible necessarily. There are other players, Rob Brown III. He's also shooting just over 7 3-point attempts per game. He's only shooting 32%. It is worth noting that last year for Nichols, Brown shot 41% from 3. So he is a much better 3-point shooter than what he has showed at this point in the season. So do add a couple guys who are going to take a lot of threes, who, if they get hot, that could make things maybe a little more interesting than we want them to be. But by and large, this is not a particularly good offensive team. Defensively, they don't turn you over. They don't force a lot of turnovers. They don't get a lot of steals. They block a fair amount of shots, although they don't have a lot of size on this roster right now. They're 14.3% opponent turnover rate. That ranks 331st in the country at KenPom. So they're basically one of the 30 worst teams in college basketball in terms of forcing turnovers. Their 5.1% non-steal turnover rate, that's 359th in the country. What that means is that they are among the 5 worst teams in college basketball at forcing turnovers not by steals. So forcing shot clock violations or things of that nature. Some of this particular data set can be a little bit difficult to exactly correlate with the team, because if you're playing a team that just travels a whole bunch of times, like that's going to skew the data a little bit. But especially over this kind of sample size, when a lot of their opponents are not particularly good on their own, it stands out that they are really not good at forcing the opponent to turn the basketball over. And then last, and this is pretty common the case with teams in this kind of conversation, 250 range for KenPom, they're not very big. The biggest player on this roster is 6'8". They have a couple guys who stand 6'8", but that's it. Like, not even just, the biggest guy in the rotation. No, the biggest player, period, on the roster for the Colonels stands 6'8". All four of Gonzaga's bigs are 6'8" or bigger. I guess Michael Jai's right around 6'8", but Greg, Huff, EK, all bigger than that. This is just not a team that has the size to hang with a lot of high major programs, and certainly doesn't have the size to hang with Gonzaga and how they like to operate with the basketball in their hands. Before we move on to talk about the keys to this game, I do want to give a shout out to Jalen Series, who's on the roster from Mill Creek, Washington. He's on the Nichols roster, I should say, mainly because I thought it was funny that Gonzaga is now going to have played 2 straight games against teams that roster a player named Jalen who's from the Seattle area. His UConn, of course, has Jalen Stewart, who's from Seattle, who is a sophomore who hit a couple of real goofy shots against Gonzaga in that game at the Madison Square Garden. Now you got Jalen Series from Mill Creek suiting up for Nichols. Doesn't mean anything, just kind of a fun little anecdote about this roster I found while doing some research. Well, like we've kind of said throughout the first part of the show, this is not really an opponent that Gonzaga should have a lot of trouble with, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we want to see from this matchup, notably a few players who haven't looked right the last couple of games, seeing them try to get back on track. We're going to talk about what we want to see in this game tonight, coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, get ready to tackle the college hoops action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and you will get $150 in bonus bets if you win. And the FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. I said we'd talk about the spread a little bit later. The Zags currently at FanDuel, 32.5-point favorites to win this basketball game on Wednesday. There's also an over-under of 154.5. I'll be honest with you, I like the over a bit more than I like the spread in this one. But if you like the spread, if you like the over-under, if you like any of the other great odds they have at FanDuel, just visit FanDuel.com to join today. As a reminder, you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. Today's episode is also brought to you by Prize Picks. Folks, make your holidays bigger and brighter with Prize Picks, the best place to get real money action while watching your favorite sports. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. All you have to do is pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app. And join now because this holiday season, Prize Picks is giving away 2 free picks in December, and they're giving away $30+ million in rewards during Picksmas. Download the app today. Use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. All right, folks, segment 2. Still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still getting you ready for tonight's matchup between the Gonzaga Bulldogs and the Nicholls Colonels, which is a kind of a funny phrase to say consecutively. For those of you who are longtime listeners to the show, or even just if you started this year, you know that when we do these keys to the victory, keys to the game type segments before a game, we try to tailor them towards the opponent. In a situation where it's a game that Gonzaga needs to execute multiple things in order to win, like Kentucky or UConn or Indiana or Baylor or Arizona State or San Diego, et cetera, for this year, there's been a lot of them. We typically focus on what do they need to do to win. In games like this one, where it's less, the concern about the outcome is less prevalent, we focus more on what do we want to see? What are questions we have that we want to get answered? What are results we want to see out of this game that aren't necessarily just a win for the Zags? So we're more focused in that area for this game specifically. So key number 1, thought number 1 is about Graham Ike. Ultimately, the Zags need to get Graham Ike back on track. And whether it's a key to them getting a victory or just something they need to do is kind of irrelevant in this situation. But ultimately, the Zags are at their best when Graham Ike is playing like an All-American. There's been discussion about whether he should be benched, whether you should start Braden Huff, et cetera, as we laid out a little bit on Tuesday's show. Ultimately, who starts, who doesn't start is less relevant to me personally than who's playing more minutes. We've seen that outside of a few game, like outside really of the Kentucky game for Graham, he's played less than 20 minutes per night. Huff is playing as much or more than him most of the time. But for this team to be at their peak, for this team to legitimately compete for a Final Four national championship, Graham Ike needs to be that dude. He's not been that guy outside of really a couple of halves a great half against Kentucky, a great half against San Diego State. He didn't show up for the UConn game. It was a huge problem for the Zags. This is an opportunity for him to get right. And yes, I understand that Graham Ike going out and dominating against a team that doesn't have a guy even within 2 inches of his height is probably not going to sway a lot of fans in terms of their perception about him and his performance this year. I'm not saying Graham needs to have a good game to turn people's minds. I'm saying Graham needs to have a good game because he needs to see the basketball go in the net. He needs to get that swagger back, that confidence, going down the floor, posting somebody up and knowing that he's going to get the basketball, he's going to turn over his shoulder, and he's going to put the ball in the net. That confidence, that arrogance, that swagger, whatever you want to call it, has been missing from Graham. We saw it in the first half against Kentucky, and it vanished in the second half. He didn't have a particularly bad second half compared to other players on the team. Kentucky was effective at neutralizing him by throwing that zone out there and things like that. But for Graham, he needs to feel more confident. And this game and the game against Bucknell give him two opportunities to really start to feel more like himself. Remember, it was about late December last year where Graham Ike really turned it on. It's frustrating that we have to kind of hope and see if he does the same thing this year. But if he does, we're going to feel pretty good about what his performance could look like in January, February, and into March, and hopefully into April. But this is an opportunity for him to get a bit of a turning point and start to play more like the guy we saw in the second half of last year and not the guy we've seen in the first part of this season. Key number 2 for Gonzaga is to find that outside shot because it's lost. We haven't seen it in a while. We haven't really seen it most of this year. The Zags have made exactly 6 3-pointers in each of their past 4 games. They've shot 33% or worse from 3 as a team in 5 of their last 7 games. The only 2 where they were better than 33% were UConn, where they were 37.5%, and Davidson, where they were also 37.5%. As we mentioned in the recap episode about UConn, yes, the team shot 37.5% from 3, but that was Caleb Battle going 4 of 6, and the rest of the team going 2 of 10. This team has major issues shooting the basketball. Kentucky went to a zone and it completely flummoxed Gonzaga. And as I said, one of the things that's been frustrating about this team, not just in that game and the UConn game, although prominently in those 2 games, but also in other games as well, is that a lot of the stuff isn't what appears to be a coaching issue in the sense of, oh, they're not running the right scheme, they're not doing the right things. A lot of times Gonzaga's offense is getting them the look that they want to get, and they're just not making it. Gonzaga shot 0 of 9 for 3 in the second half against Kentucky. I was at that game. Many of you were at that game or watching that game on TV. It wasn't a lot of bad shots that Gonzaga was just bricking. Oftentimes it was open looks. Mark Pope gambled that Gonzaga was not a great 3-point shooting team and that making them shoot over the zone was going to be a problem for the team. I don't think even he expected them to not make a single 3 in the second half, but that is what happened. This is a game where Gonzaga they need to find it. They need to find it. Nolan Hickman needs to come back. He played 12 minutes against UConn. He barely played in the second half. He had 1 shot attempt. It wasn't a 3-pointer. He was a complete non-factor in a way that he hasn't been in years. I don't think there was a game last year, or at least not a significant game, where Nolan Hickman was that absent. It was startling and problematic for this team as he is their best high-volume 3-point shooter. They need Nolan Hickman back. Now, what we know about Nolan Hickman, he freaking loves playing at the Kennel. He loves it. He dances with the crowd. He's into it. He's enthusiastic. The crowd loves him. He loves them. This is a great opportunity for him to find that shot, find that kind of confidence that he needs. And if him and Graham can both do that, that's going to make this game feel a lot better, regardless of what the score is. Also, let's get Dusty Stromer some more opportunities. Let's get the bigs. Ben Gregg, Braden Huff, Michael Ajayi, they're all shooting well below their 3-point average this historically coming into this season. Let's get those guys back on track. Again, 1 game against Nicholls isn't going to turn the tide for all of them, but it sure would be nice for at least 1 or 2 of those guys to see a few more shots go in than we've been seeing up to this point in the season. Key number 3 for the Zags in this game is to mess with some lineups, try some new things. Experiment. You don't get to do this against Kentucky or UConn or any of the games in the Battle for Atlantis, or again, San Diego State, Arizona State, Baylor, etc. You don't get to do this. This is a chance to do that. I think one of the biggest things the Zags need to work on is a zone offense. And unfortunately, you can't really control whether you're going to work on a zone offense in a game or not. That's kind of up to the Nichols State and their coach. If they play a zone, great. Gonzaga gets to work on a zone offense. If they don't, well, you can't really run a zone offense against a man defense and effectively get better at working on it. That's just not really an option. But there are obviously other things the Zags can work on. I think working on offensive sets that don't involve just getting the ball into the paint. Entry passes has been Gonzaga's bread and butter for a very long time, whether it's the high-low, whether it's just running those ball screen actions at the top of the key, whether it's just swinging things around, pass, screen away, things like that. Everything's kind of predicated around getting the ball to either Graham or Braden on the block. And I think they need to do that in this game, again, as mentioned before, in order to get Graham feeling a little bit better. But also, let's see some other stuff. Let's run some plays designed to get Caleb Battle going downhill. Let's run some plays to get Dusty Stromer open from three. Let's run some more pick and roll action with Ryan Nembhard to get, whether it's a pick and pop with Braden Huff, whether it's a full short roll with Graham Ike, whether they run it with Ben or Michael or somebody else, whether they have Nolan run the pick and roll, which was very effective in spurts last year for the Zags. Try some of that stuff. This is a good game to do that. If Nichols double teams Graham Ike and Braden Huff, which I suspect they probably will, that's a great opportunity to work on that too. Work on what you want that to look like. There were times in the games, the game in particular against UConn when Graham was getting double teamed where nobody really moved. And it's hard to pin all that on Graham. He did not have a good game. Still not going to continue to defend him necessarily. But if you get double teamed and nobody on your team moves, or nobody's moving to try to get open, to try to give you an opportunity to get the ball out of your hands, not a whole lot you can do. This is an opportunity for Gonzaga to work on some of that stuff and be more prepared for the UCLA game and then some of the strong games they play when they get into conference play. Key number 4 is to get those 9, 10, 11 guys some run. Gonzaga's pretty firm on their 8-man rotation this year, as we expected they would be. The only player who's played in the month of December who's not in that top 8 is Emmanuel Innocente, and he's played. The ESPN barely even registers a single minute of action. He played both against UConn and Kentucky, but it was like seconds basically of action. So it doesn't really count. We didn't see 10 or 11, which is Ismaila Diani or Junsuk Yo, but this is a game where we expect to see all 3 of those guys. And while it's not necessarily a significant key towards them getting better this year, it doesn't hurt. It gives the other starters a little bit of rest, especially with the game coming up a couple days later against Bucknell, and it just gets these guys better. Innocente and Diani in particular are big pieces of the future for this Gonzaga program. Both of them are expected to take on bigger roles next year, and both of them are guys who need to get better by playing in-game, by gaining in-game experience this season. I'd like to see both of them get 5 to 8, if in Innocente's case, maybe 8 to 10 minutes of action. In this one, again, it's a good opportunity to get Ryan some rest, to get some of the bigs some rest, to just not force these guys to play 35 minutes in a game that hopefully is determined well before them. Yo is probably not as big of a part of the future. Next year will be his final year of eligibility. I don't expect a large jump in playing time necessarily, especially after the addition of Jalen Warley for next year. But it's always good to get him some action. You never know when you're going to need him. He's somebody who's been in the system for a long time. He's getting more comfortable with what he's being asked to do on the floor. I think he's somebody who can contribute if they need him to. And when the opportunity arises for him to play, I hope that they give him a chance to do so. And then last but not least, return of the walk-ons. Joe Few's been banged up. We haven't seen him on the floor in a long time. We haven't seen any of the walk-ons on the floor in a long time, but I'm curious if Joe's going to play. Is there still a health issue? Is he still hurting? Is he done for the year? Is he going to play in this game? What are we going to see? And then, of course, the other 2 walk-ons who are eligible to play this year, that would be Joaquin Reyes-Moore, a.k.a. Q, and then Noah Holland, the junior college transfer. Q's already scored 5 points this year. He's already got 5 points and 4 rebounds. He's played 7 minutes, folks. I love that Q is going out there hacking up shots as soon as he gets in the game. It has been really fun to watch him get those opportunities. The Kennel crowd loves him. Hopefully this is a game so determined by the end of the contest with 90 seconds to go that he gets a chance to play. And then Noah Holland, a legacy. Both his parents went to Gonzaga. Would be fun. He's played a few games, very little action, but he hasn't scored yet. Would be fun to see him get his first points either in this game or on Saturday against Bucknell. Well, switching gears to close out the show, Pac-12 Commissioner Teresa Gould revealed there is a ton of interest from media partners in working with the conference. So we're going to discuss what that means, whether she's given us the legit truth or whether she's just saying what people want to hear. We're also going to talk a little bit about the Gonzaga UCLA game time change. All that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, it is that time of year. The college football playoffs are back. And with the newly expanded 12-team format, it's guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting and high-flying excitement that you love. And TNT Sports' coverage of the college football playoff begins on December 21st, starting with the college football playoff kickoff show presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, leading into our first matchup, the SMU Mustangs battling the Penn State Nittany Lions at noon. And then later, the Clemson Tigers look to upset the Texas Longhorns in a showdown at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch the college football playoff presented by Allstate live on TNT, True TV, TBS, and Max. All right, folks, still a Locked On Zags podcast, still chatting with Andy Patton here and still talking, well, not still talking about the game against Nichols State on Wednesday. We're in fact moving on to talk about some recent comments by the commissioner of the Pac-12, Teresa Gould, about their pursuit of a new media rights deal for the conference. Gonzaga is, of course, joining in 2026. Commissioner Gould spoke to Austin Karp of Sports Business Journal on the Sports Media Podcast. I believe this conversation happened on either Sunday or Monday, and some of the quotes were pulled out here, and I want to just kind of read through what she said, talk about what it means for Gonzaga, what it means for the Pac-12. She says the response from potential partners for the Pac-12 media deal has been, quote, overwhelming. And here's the rest of her quote. She says, "It just reinforces what I already knew when I took this job, which was people really care about the Pac-12 brand. It really means something in the marketplace. The media rights partner interest has been really, really extraordinary. They are pleased with the strength of the conference top to bottom competitively. They are pleased with the relevance of the brands that we have, and the interest has just been incredible." So we know that Commissioner Gould's job is to get the most amount of money and the best possible media rights deal for the conference affiliated programs that she can. It stands to reason that saying something like this is done with the intent of driving up interest and kind of making sure that the media partners that they are talking with or other prospective media partners or other conferences are put on notice. Does that mean that she's not telling the truth? No. I don't think that she's lying about this. I think they are getting legitimate interest from media partners, but I certainly think that there is an element of making this sound as good as possible, which again is part of her job. It's not a criticism. It's just acknowledging that that is what she's setting out to do by doing these kinds of interviews. And so, of course, the language that she uses and the what she says is going to be kind of through that lens. So I do think that that is an important thing to acknowledge about this. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that the media partners probably are excited and they probably are enthusiastic about getting opportunities to work with the Pac-12, but there's probably some, I don't want to say skepticism, that's not the right word, but they need to wait to see the full picture. The Pac-12 is not done. We know that. We know that definitively because the Pac-12 cannot currently be done as constructed and be an FBS conference in college football. They can't. They have to add at least one more school, a full partner. They can't just add a football only member. They have to add a full membership program that has football and that competes with the rest of the football teams in order to be a viable league in 2026. So we know there's at least one more edition coming. There's likely more than that. And again, the media partners' excitement around the Pac-12 is going to be different if the Pac-12's final edition is Sacramento State and they don't do anything else versus their final edition being Memphis, and also they're adding Tulane and UTSA and Central Florida. That changes the dynamic. It changes the perception of the conference nationally, and it certainly changes the interest from media rights partners, the price tag for the Pac-12. It changes a lot of things. All of that is known. I don't think that Teresa needs to be saying that out loud. Again, that's pretty well established and kind of known at this point. But the fact that there is interest without knowing the full picture is a promising sign for the conference. It's a promising sign for Gonzaga. Other things that Teresa Gould said, she mentioned that is likely a mixture of linear television media rights deals and streaming services. I'll read her direct quote here. She says, "When I talk to our athletic directors and our head coaches, they are really looking to bring in different audiences with different demographics. I think for us to meet our aspirational goals in terms of the fandom we want to have around our brands, we're going to need to see a mixture of both. And that's the way we're thinking about it and the way we're approaching it in the marketplace." Again, I don't think this is rocket science, but I think it's important. I think she's right. I think it is what the Pac-12 and I think what most conferences who are renegotiating media rights deals should be doing. If the only media you're pursuing is the type of media that is currently being consumed less and less and less and less, you are setting yourself up for failure. Adapt or die. I know not everybody's super enthusiastic about the potential of Gonzaga being on Peacock or Max or Apple TV or any of the other potential streaming services that are out there. I get it. I'm not thrilled about it either, as somebody who has some of those services but doesn't necessarily want to have to commit to all of them. But it would be stupid of the Pac-12 to only put their product on network TV. It would be stupid of the Pac-12 to limit themselves from a media perspective to a type of dying company. That is not a good idea. So I think this is smart. Again, I don't think it is rocket science that this is what they're looking to do, but having diversity in a modern era, in the cord cutting era, totally makes sense. I would also want to say, based on her comments here, the CW, expect that to remain a partner. The CW was a very successful partnership with the Pac-12 this past year. In fact, Gould said, by every measurement imaginable, year one of the Pac-12 relationship with the CW surpassed all expectations. We are very, very pleased with the distribution, the number of eyeballs that tuned in. She said the 3 most watched games on the CW this past year were Pac-12 games, and 5 of the top 6. The CW also has a partnership with the ACC. So the fact that Oregon State and Washington State were involved in 5 of the 6 highest rated games on the CW is a very good sign for the health of the Pac-12, for the interest in the football brands, at least. Obviously, this doesn't really relate to basketball, which is kind of what I wanted to say next, is like, not a lot of this really tells us a ton about basketball yet. And I am very curious what this will mean for Gonzaga, because we know that ESPN, and to a lesser extent, CBS, love the Zags. ESPN loves the Zags. They love them. They want to show the Zags as much as possible. They love late night programming in January, February, even in December, the 10 p.m. Eastern time, even 11 p.m. Eastern time, getting to start at that time and having a marquee product that thousands upon thousands of people are going to watch. That is just printing money for ESPN. They know it. They're very well aware of it. That's why they love working with Gonzaga. Does that partnership between Gonzaga and ESPN carry enough cachet that the Pac-12 can leverage that into a media deal with ESPN? Would it be just basketball? Would ESPN say no thanks on football, but we want to do a deal with basketball? Would they just try to parse out the Gonzaga? There's a lot of questions here. Is the Pac-12 capable of leveraging Gonzaga's interest from a TV perspective into a deal with ESPN? If so, big old hat tip to Teresa Gould. That's very impressive. Is it going to be CBS? Is Gonzaga not going to be on ESPN anymore because they don't want the headache of dealing with the Pac-12 when they already have partnerships with other more high-profile conferences, college football conferences? Those are all the questions that we don't have answers to right now. I can tell you right now with confidence, the CW, they would love to have Gonzaga basketball games on the CW. Is that viable for Gonzaga? Is that what Gonzaga wants? Is that what the Pac-12 commissioner wants? I suspect they want to be able to use Gonzaga and their very, very strong, dedicated fan base from a TV metric perspective, which is one of the 5 best in all of college basketball. They want to use that to get this program on a national network and to get the rest of their Pac-12 schools on a national network as well. Will it work? I don't know. It's probably going to be easier if they also have Memphis, or if they also have some other strong basketball brands, even St. Mary's as a strong basketball brand. They don't have nearly the TV power as Gonzaga, but at least it's a game that people would tune into. Those are the questions that we don't have answers to. We're not going to get answers to them anytime super soon. Don't hold your breath for answers to some of those questions. But they are very interesting things. I would love to be able to have conversations with some of the people behind the scenes and get a sense of what that could look like for Gonzaga, because they are such a unique part of the Pac-12, not just because they're the only one that doesn't have football, although yes, that is obviously a part of it, but because their basketball and their brand recognition in that space is just landslides ahead of everybody else in the Pac-12, and really has such a unique kind of footprint that I'm curious how the Pac-12 will navigate trying to market that particular product. I mentioned this already. I'll just say it quickly here. The Zags game against UCLA has been moved to 1 p.m. Pacific time on December 28th. It was originally scheduled for 5 p.m., but the NFL flexed a game between the Rams and Cardinals to Saturday at 5 p.m. Having both these games at the same time, about a mile apart from each other, would have been even more of a nightmare for the LA traffic than it is going to be at this point. So they moved the game up. It's at 1 p.m. I've already heard from a few people who are having to potentially change some flights to get in a little earlier. That's frustrating. I apologize to those of you who are going through that. That's no fun, but it's the reality of sports media in the current landscape. So that is the situation for the Zags. 1 p.m. Pacific time. This is part of a two-game series at the Intuit Dome. The other game is Grand Canyon versus San Diego. As I checked right before I hit record, that game is listed as time TBD. So I'm very curious if it'll end up being after the Gonzaga game, if they'll bump it all the way up before the Gonzaga game at like 10 a.m. What's going to happen with that game? But we do know that Zags, Bruins, Mark Few, Mick Cronin, big time matchup to close out the year. That game is going to be at 1 p.m. now at the Intuit Dome in the Los Angeles area. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much. Those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day, enjoy the game tonight. It's going to be a fantastic one. We'll get a recap of this game. We'll also get you ready for that game against Bucknell on Saturday. And then next week, we'll be celebrating the holidays, talking about what we're thankful for, talking about some Christmas gift ideas for some of our Zags. And then, of course, we'll get you ready for that big one against the UCLA Bruins next Saturday. Until then, as always, have a fantastic day. And go Zags.